So in total, there are already some 300 people between the two social networks.
Mm-hmm.
My father slept in the bathroom yesterday night. He didn't. I mean, he's fine, but yeah, the poor guy got a hit.
You mean
Hola.
Hola, hola.
Yes, am I in the right one? We're all in the right link, right?
Sí.
Okay.
Yep.
You are. We are assigning you the interpretation module.
Uy, se te oye como si tuvieras interrupción de internet, José. ¿Aló? ¿José? No, ¿ustedes le oyeron bien? Did you hear José okay?
No, no.
No. He's like interrupted.
José. Bueno, vamos a ver.
Hola.
Es
Listo.
que se te había cortado tu voz, José.
No te preocupes, ya te acabo de asignar el módulo de interpretación. Entonces,
Bueno, listo. Te pido, José, que siempre me estés oyendo, sea en inglés o sea en español, para yo poder comunicarme contigo y decirte oigo, no oigo o cualquier cosa, ¿sí?
claro que sí.
Óyeme, escúchame siempre al idioma que esté.
Aquí te tenemos, sí, no te preocupes, ya te tenemos
Listo.
aquí dos computadores en los dos canales, ¿listo?
Ok,
Entonces,
una pregunta. Do you need anything from me before I disappear and you won't be able to talk to me anymore?
hold on.
Okay.
I just turned on the English interpretation. So when you ask, and then I couldn't hear you. So.
Because I have not enabled it yet. It's trying to know if you needed something from me before that.
I just turned off the interpretation button.
Mm-hmm.
I need to turn that on now because I won't be able to hear you anymore, right?
Yes, that's right. Que pregunta Duncan si ya al yo salirme y él ya conectar inglés, ya no va a oír nada, sino solo cuando yo le traduzca preguntas, ¿cierto? Y ya queda solo charlando con Diego, ¿cierto?
Diego, tell me, do I need to know what?
así es.
No, that's fine. I mean, let's not worry about anything that happens with them. We simply have to chat together and they'll take care of things.
Okay, good. So I couldn't understand this.
Yeah. We just have to talk and they'll be translating. Yeah. Everything will happen back office.
That's the way we like it to be.
We'll be in the front office.
The staff of the Dominion of the Judges will take over. They're well staffed.
Yeah. José, entonces me dices cuándo arrancamos, ¿no? I'll do a very brief introduction. I'll do a very big introduction in Spanish. It sounds better like to relate to the audience in Spanish and talk a little bit about it. And then I'll switch into English and be there for the rest of the event. Entonces me dices, José, ¿cuándo arrancamos?
So Diego, when the questions come,
Diego.
Can you hear me? When the questions,
3 minutes.
If I don't understand the question, I may say, help me understand the question, and try to reformulate it. I may get you to help me with the question.
Absolutely. So we start in 3 minutes, they say.
It's very exciting.
It is great.
So interesting to think of these. What a great audience, right?
Absolutely. And we were somehow Yeah, we had not really got into this type of communication, right? We had resistance to it, at least I did. And then it is an opening of opportunities, right?
We just organized this conference. Everyone said it wouldn't possibly work. So it's one of the first online conferences in the legal universe that was completely online. There were 50 participants. Everybody came, partly because the destruction of everyone's schedule, they wanted to come and do something collective. And we never could have organized this event, which had people from all over the world, in person. So the school was represented transnationally and nationally. There were 53 people there. No more than 20 of those people, or 25, would ever have come to Cambridge.
Yeah, yeah.
So this was an event that couldn't have happened before the technology.
Yeah, I know.
Amazing,
I know.
amazing.
And in our openness to embrace it, because the technology did exist, right?
Yeah, yes. Though it's going to get better and better with this demand for it. So
absolutely.
But also the four of us, none of us were competent. It was pretty pathetic. So we were totally dependent in designing it. We don't really know yet what we can do with it. So the possibilities are only beginning to us who organize this one. And as I said, I have a couple more that I want to organize, I think, which will be much better because we know more about breakout groups, dividing and subdividing the groups, chat rooms, a million things like this. Chat rooms, all going to be about chat rooms.
We can start now.
Yeah. Okay, ¿listo?
Sí, señor, adelante. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Hagamos.
Bueno, buenas tardes a todos y a todas. Mi nombre es Diego López Medina. Los estoy saludando en esta tarde. Hoy estamos relanzando la página web diegolopezmedina.net, que es un espacio que queremos poner disponibles para la formación de una comunidad jurídica constructiva y crítica, y iremos desarrollando poco a poco actividades en ese espacio. Nuestra primera evento pues es realmente extraordinario. He tenido el gusto de invitar al profesor Duncan Kennedy. Él es profesor emérito de la Facultad de Derecho de la Universidad de Harvard. Es un buen amigo, muy querido. Fue uno de los co-supervisores o co-tutores de mi tesis doctoral, y es ciertamente un profesor y un doctrinante de la mayor importancia, no solamente por sus calidades intelectuales y políticas, sino también por sus calidades personales. Entonces, les voy a explicar brevemente la dinámica del evento. Duncan y yo empezaremos conversando durante unos 40 minutos. Por razones tecnológicas, yo voy a conversar con Duncan en inglés. La señora Patricia Aljure, que está con nosotros, nos hará la traducción simultánea para aquellos de ustedes que quieran oírlo en el canal en español, y aquellos de ustedes que quieran seguir la conversación en inglés lo pueden hacer en el canal en inglés. Al finalizar esta conversación de, insisto, unos 40, 50 minutos, abriremos el espacio para las preguntas. Y pues a partir de esas preguntas que ustedes nos hagan, pues seguiremos conversando otro rato más, de tal manera que estaremos acabando el evento hacia las 6:30, 6:45, para un total de unos 80, 90 minutos. Hi, Duncan. Good to see you. Hi, Duncan. Can you listen to me?
Yes, I can.
Good. So I'm very happy to see you. It's a wonderful opportunity to talk together about CLS and intellectual projects that we've had throughout the years. I thank you for being today with us, and I want to welcome you and give you an opportunity to say hello to everybody.
So I'd like to say hello to everybody, to all of you. We saw from the survey that you're very numerous, which is slightly frightening, scattered as you are across the Zoom universe. But I particularly want to welcome younger jurists who are, that you're interested in CLS is itself very satisfying. It's an old man's satisfaction. I'm a retired 78-year-old professor, and it just warms my heart when I'm revived and people say it could be interesting. But I also should say about Diego that, you know, people have favorite students. It's a disgusting custom all over the educational world. So just let me say that Diego is a great student, a uniquely great student, an extraordinarily good student. And I learned an enormous amount from him. In fact, in several of my, what I see as my most important articles that I wrote after Diego graduated, Diego figures prominently right at the beginning as a person who has practiced and developed the approach that I'm going to use in the article, which is his approach to the question of the transnational, question of sites of production of legal discourse and theory, sites of reception, the existence of a form of transnational theory. This was an extraordinary innovation, and sitting there watching him do it, at first I didn't believe it. I was very skeptical. Also, how did he know how to do this? And he did. And then it turned out he was a friend. We have many common projects. When we've worked together, it's been amazing, satisfying, just at a personal level. So thank you for having me. I'm really honored that you chose to do this.
Thank you, Duncan. Likewise. Let me ask you a first question to initiate this conversation. CLS, or it's the name of a movement that gets going on in the United States in very particular political circumstances. It's part of a generational struggle, of a new understanding of the law, which is very much embedded and entrenched in American politics. And it has become somehow a global jurisprudential movement. So how do you see that? How can you begin with an intensely national political maneuver, and how has it become a transglobal jurisprudential phenomenon?
So that's a great question. It starts far down the story. So maybe I should begin by saying that critical legal studies, when people use the term, there's quite different meanings which are consistent. There is critical legal studies, the movement, and then there's critical legal studies, the school. And the school and the movement need to be understood as distinct from each other. And then you could say that there's a canon of critical legal studies, which is a specific list of readings of works, of literary works that are generally accepted in the way that canons are constructed, not consciously constructed, but they're viciously determinative. So there is a movement, there's a school, and there's a canon. So to say, your question was about the movement. So let me answer about the movement, and then we can talk about the school and the canon. So the movement is, its origins are the political situation of the very end of the 1960s and the beginning of the dark 1970s in American politics. And the movement was associated with young law professors, all young law professors, so completely right that it's generational, whose professors were, and this is important to understand in the Latin American context, our professors were anti-formalist, left progressives, moderate, center-left, somewhat progressive. There were no radicals, either in the sense of just extreme people, or there were no Marxists, there were no anarchists. There was nothing like that. But the professors were not conservative. They identified with the liberal programs of the Johnson administration and Kennedy, and they would be always to the left of Eisenhower. So they understood themselves to be men of the progressive movement. And we detested their collaboration as professors who were part of the intelligentsia of the ruling class in the war in Vietnam, in the failure to respond to the civil rights movement with the kind of radical measures that we thought were necessary. So our rebellion was against moderate left, not against the right, because the right was out of power. It was just about, that was all about to change. So we produced a critique, which actually now it's a little paradoxical to explain that it could be spread, because the critique of this form of moderate legal thinking about society, typified by the Hart and Sachs legal process materials, is something that has no equivalent, I believe, and I think Diego confirmed this to me just now. There is no equivalent in Latin America. So the basic experience that we had, paradoxically, how could it spread? So very, very puzzling.
Duncan, what was Lon Fuller also in that mixture?
He would be a perfect representative. Lon Fuller would be an exquisitely perfect representative of that against which we were in rebellion. And also the very famous Alexander Bickel was another in constitutional law. He was a leading, very important, major American constitutional theorist, who at that point was a moderate leftist who then became a conservative. He became a conservative partly because he hated our dirty, radical student behaviors. He thought we were awful. So yes, Lon Fuller, Alexander Bickel, but a whole generation of leading professors at Yale and Stanford and Columbia and Harvard, they were the people we were rebelling against. So I think now I want to suggest two interesting explanations of the capacity of the movement to globalize, but very important, it didn't globalize until it was almost dead as a movement in the United States. So now let me say a word, what makes it a movement? What makes, I would say, a school, not just a school, but a movement, is two factors. The participants understand that they're moving, that they're engaged in a common project, diffuse, not necessarily well-defined, but a common project in the Sartre sense, which has a target, and it's in opposition to some aspect of the way things are, and its goal is to change a status quo by the mechanism of growing. So the movement presupposes a desire to recruit and expand. That was no longer present. That was in CLS from even its babiness at Yale, all the way, its Harvard phase, all the way through the 1980s. But very important, it was a movement in law faculties, which had as its premise that a law faculty was a plausible site of activism for a reason different from Latin American law faculty activism of that in the previous period. We didn't want to seize power, and we didn't want to turn the university into an instrument of our left projects. We wanted to subvert it, so to speak, do battle with the status quo professors on their own terms and dominate them intellectually while disrupting the forms of their social existence. And so there was the intellectual challenge to moderate leftism in the name of something more radical. But the second thing there was their mode of social existence was the magisterial. It was the Socratic method. It was a participatory ideology that was not participatory. It was a participatory ideology, which was an instrument of total building hegemony through individual domination in the classroom, in which the good professors were terrifying. Bad professors were not good enough to scare us. That was the distinction. And also against, so the intellectual challenge, let me put it this way. One basis of globalization was a universal youth revolt against the style of patriarchal domination in the law faculty classroom. So legal education and the reproduction of hierarchy was originally a pamphlet. It was a self-published pamphlet, which was using stolen IP, intellectual property resources of the university, and published for virtually nothing, like $1 a copy, and distributed at CLS meetings as an organizing document. That was and that book has been translated into Spanish, as I'm sure you're aware, as well as into several other languages. And it was an instrument of globalization because regardless of the intellectual content, it was a celebration of rebellion against the style of existence of the magisterial professor and the organization of the law faculty. And it didn't matter what the intellectual substance was. It was globalized because it is intolerable when the law professor has his foot on your neck and is demanding you say, yes, yes, I'm so happy, I wish to be like you and help me get a job and make a lot of money. So this mode of existence was what it was. That's the first source of.
Right. If I may, Duncan, it's difficult when you read that piece here in Latin America to get the rebellion against the center-left professors. Rather, we get a rebellion against very formal, very rigid ways of classroom that translate later into very also rigid ways of practicing the law. And actually you get a very conservative image of those professors from that picture that you take of them in your piece.
So this is an example of what you would call the mode of misreading that's characteristic of a situation where the context, the American context, is just not accessible. And it fits. Now, I believe that there's an element of the universal in the parasital rage. I'm speaking as a 78-year-old grandfather here, there's something very globalizable in that. But here's a second factor, which is really interesting in its success in Europe and Latin America, globalizing in those directions, which is your characterization of CLS is completely correct as a political movement. It's originally about the war in Vietnam and the civil rights movement, and then it's about Ronald Reagan, and it's a law faculty rebellion against those unbelievably American formations. But remember, the idea is to attack inside the law faculty on the terms of the professors. Everyone in CLS was always saying, why aren't we influencing the national debate? What about national power? What are we doing for the resistance? Blah, 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 blah. My attitude was, you're just being silly. There's no chance in the United States that a groupuscule of radical left professors are going to influence the political order. We are talking about a few dozen or maybe hundreds of people. Don't be ridiculous. But my motive was anarcho-syndicalist, was that in the specific site of the workplace, we could have a radical left movement, and we would be part, if it worked, there would be anarcho-syndicalist impulses in elite institutions all over the place, and we could join together. So the Union of Radical Political Economists, which was an economics professor's group, that was a hopeful possible ally. Unfortunately, all these formations were dead by 1980 as a result of internal insane factional squabbles, which we would mock by saying the Albanian question was central to their survival. You know what the Albanian question is? So its relationship to Stalin and Mao. So they were crazy and they all died. So there was no equivalent anarcho-syndicalist moments of struggle in the institutions with which we could ally, but we were actually much more successful in disrupting the legal academy than we thought, partly because we attacked their doctrinalists. We attacked them as doctrina, on the grounds that they failed to understand the most important developments of thinking about law and everything else, but particularly about everything else, because we were into European critical social thought, its history, and its practice, and its present. So one of the reasons why we could globalize was that readers in Latin America and Europe could recognize some ways in which we're all provincial critical intellectuals. We want Foucault and Marx or whoever to be relevant. That's relevant to globalization. It was there because we could use that against our elders. We accused them of being ignoramuses about the course of the history of spirit. They just didn't understand anything that had happened since maybe Max Weber. Although many of them thought they knew something of Max Weber, their version of Max Weber, say, was he showed that communism was bad in various ways. It was just an anti-communist reading of Weber. So we actually, another source of the possibilities of globalization was specifically the attempt to incorporate fancy, as we called them, famous dead Europeans. So we called them famous dead Europeans, and we played the card against our older conventional progressive colleagues, and that made our writing accessible to a European and Latin American legal audience where, unlike the United States, critical theory existed in the university. So,
Duncan, if I may, you insisted a lot at the beginning of your answer that the difference between the movement and the school was important.
mm-hmm.
I remember that interesting conversation that you had with Peter Gable that was published later on the Yale Law Review, Roll Over Beethoven, right? In which
Yes.
you two dispute a lot about the psycho-spiritual meaning of the movement. And, and being a person who grew to young adult in the 90s, I cannot fail but seeing that piece and that effort to build a movement as a very 60s type of thing, part of the hippie movement, one which was very much into the authenticity, probably the authenticity of one's own life, and something which we do not have a very clear relationship. I mean, modern readers, because the very idea of movement and the internal results that ideas produce within the movement are a bit strange for us. If you can expand a little bit about this psycho-spiritual meaning of the movement, how it felt from inside, and how it was a very important part of the intellectual intervention.
So yeah, this is a good point. And it's so by the piece that you referenced by Peter Gable, who is one of my oldest friends, we've been friends since 1970. That piece is an exposition of an attempt on our part to develop both a division within the movement and a kind of definition of the psychospiritual dimension that you're talking about. So it's both that it is typical of movements, and this is true also of radical political parties, but we were not a pre-party formation. I don't know what that's going to be for Patricia in Spanish, but not a pre-party formation. We didn't understand ourselves as prefiguring the party, the universal party of the ruling class, and we weren't going to the hills, although all around us, some radicals were going underground, not anything like Latin America. If they were successful and disastrous, they were murdered and they killed 2 or 3 people and they were all dead. So it's a very different thing, but the prestige of that activism was something we were against. So in the 60s thing, there's what you might call the more hippie thing, and then there was the radical militant thing. So we were in complete rebellion against sectarian, hyper-radical, hyper-theorized Marxism groups. But we were also in rebellion against pure New Age spiritual approach, both to social organization of the movement and to scholarship, which rejected all structure and believed on universal love as the base. So we're negotiating this space in between. And so one way to put it would be Peter, who has recently published a book which actually summarizes everything much better than what I'm going to say would be a brief capsule, that the psychospiritual moment of the 60s is not just I always emphasize the patricidal generation rebellion. He overwhelmingly emphasized the moment of solidarity, of newly emerging solidarity, which is not exactly generational. It's narrower than that. It's the people who understand our generation as having a mission, a transcendent mission of breaking down fears, barriers, neuroses, hang-ups that prevent people from relating to each other one-on-one, and therefore make real movement impossible. So his idea was a very, very common one, which on one level I completely agreed with. My own attitude was always much more oriented to, if you like, a negative dialectic. His was overwhelmingly oriented to a positive dialectic. And for him, the great puzzle was what happened. And like many of us, this was totally present to our mind in CLS. We didn't want to have happen to our moment of generational solidarity, which was substantively devoted to deformalization, cooling out the various authoritarian impulses, the power-grabbing aspect of movement. We didn't want those to do to us what they were doing to all similar movements all around us. So the idea was that required a practice of group discussion, of processing things, as it was called in the late 60s and the 70s. It was group process as a thing that you can consciously engage in which you're open to the different people in the group who can't talk, to getting them to talk. So a very powerful emphasis influenced by feminism. So a very big emphasis, source of all of this is the radical feminist creation of consciousness-raising groups in American big cities in the 1970s, a basic organizing mechanism which was astonishingly successful of the radical feminist movement. So we also wanted to say, like them, the professional is political, law is supposed to be apolitical, the family is supposed to be apolitical. So at this psycho-spiritual level, we want to recognize the inner dynamics of engaging in the academic enterprise, organized micro in the family as the law faculty, and largely in the family as a phenomenon of a discourse of domesticity. We are going to say, they say the personal is political, And the feminists among us say the professional is political. It's just as political how you treat your secretary. That's just as political as your opinion about deficit spending. And the question of how older colleagues relate to younger colleagues, faculty to students, all of those personal dimensions of academic life were the basis of the movement. So the movement was countercultural against the ethos of the law faculties. That can globalize. It's only tenuously available in the writings of critical legal studies, but it's there as an implicit basis of resistance to what the concrete daily life of the student and the young professor are like in the faculty. So the idea was it's all very well to be a big leftist, so you don't have to take up the gun. That's ridiculous. Forget that. You don't have to even vote. You don't have to work for, Jimmy Carter. But if you want to be part of the movement, you have to have some sense that you're part of a resistance and a push against the aspects of the institutional life that make people afraid of each other, make people terrified to ask their best friend what their salary is and discover that the women are paid less than the men. You have to be willing to see the local in this sense, not meaning the town, though I was very involved in the town that I lived in. It's not about that. It's anarcho-syndicalist. So the workplace can be the basis of political organization. And so one of my slogans was, we are all, because we're law professors, our critique is of state apparatuses, of state policies, private economic dominance. And for that, we are totally interested in understanding the state and formal power everywhere it's exercised. But we're not interested because we want to seize it. We're interested in it because we want to resist it. So the idea is the seduction against this psychospiritual thing is the evil, is the longing, usually for professors, not for power, but for prestige, for intra-professional power and prestige. So that was the enemy. And that was what was always deployed against us by people who wanted to co-opt us. So this required you to look right in the eye of the colleague who says, you people are idiots, but you're very smart, Diego. I really think you're really, really smart, and I like you and I can deal with you. Let me invite you to this conference. The hotel will be fantastic, and join us. It was necessary to say no, because otherwise the whole psychospiritual dimension of it would be lost. So that was a way of responding to that dimension. So I would say the critical theory appropriation of European thought combined with the micro level resistance as they're conveyed, but then the other element of globalization, the third thing that I have to quickly mention is this. By 1990, we had been, as a formal, semi-formal network, the conservatives and the centrists, the center and the center left in legal academia had decided that we should be crushed. And the result was, it was no longer possible to have a movement, because if you joined the movement, you were screwed professionally. Simple as that. The professional organization of the academy caused quite a few of us to be denied tenure. If you were a student entering the job market for professor jobs, you might be asked in the first interview, are you a crit or not? And it was completely obvious that if you said, yes, I'm a crit, you were nowhere. If your job talk was clearly very influenced by Roberto Unger and Morton Horowitz, you didn't get a job. When you got a job, you didn't get tenure. So that was the end of the movement, very sort of cleanly. So then,
if I may,
then we went abroad.
Go ahead, please.
So at that point, many of us said, well, look, I mean, this isn't working, the organization, and then a specific person. This is not the generation of Unger and Horowitz. It's principally David Kennedy is the crucial, my colleague David Kennedy was the crucial actor. Here, he became the director of the Harvard doctoral program. And he built it into an astonishing mechanism for recruiting very smart, left-leaning graduate students from all over the world. And at the same time, all of us began to be invited. And because we're no longer being invited in the United States and we all love to travel, we were easily seduced into going and peddling our wares, selling out of our peddler's sack the various ideas of critical legal studies in all kinds of places. So we became, by the vehicle of the interest already established, we were much more willing than the mainstream. Most American professors have no interest in abroad except as a vacation site or as a domain for demonstrating their cultivation, their knowledge of Renaissance painting. That's all they care about. They had no interest in foreign lawyers or foreign legal cultures at all. And when I say zero,
if I may interrupt you there,
yeah.
If I may, to me, you're very similar to Roscoe Pound in one aspect, which is you are probably the American professor who serves as an antenna with intense preoccupation and knowledge of the European experience, probably as Roscoe Pound was for his generation. And I want to ask you this. As I listen to you, it seems to me that the European and then also the Latin American legal sphere is understood as a space in which there is no relationship between history and biography, as you've been doing this little sociology of the CLS movement. Why is it that the European legal experience is so opposed to its own sociological self-understanding and self-reflection? And why is it that this type of biographical effort is so much blocked within Latin and European doctrine? What would you say that happens?
So I would say one of the great mysteries, this is all very interesting and mysterious. I'm going to give an answer and then I'm going to ask you some questions back. Because
Sure.
I've learned from you about this. Most of my intuitions about this are related through your work. So a first reflection would be that there is the anti-formalist, counter-formalist historical moment was part of a cultural modernist moment in the United States, which spread across all professions and all modes of knowledge, an anti-formalist and modernist. So it's also extremely sensitive to individual biography and the role of the artist, the performer, the actor, and the academic as cultural creators. And there was already a 19th century historical anti-legalist critique that had a basic, so there's a cultural base of rejection of the pretensions of the professors to be apolitical scientists for whom all those things are irrelevant. So that moment in the United States, which has its, and Roscoe Pound was obsessed with being in contact with every anti-formalist movement everywhere in the world. And he collected the anti-formalist tendencies, but he could do that because as an anti-formalist, he was the dean of the Harvard Law School. So this is the king of anti-formalism, then a political progressive version of anti-formalism with a lot of institution and cultural power. And so but he was in contact, he was very aware that there was in some sense that the United States was sort of a leading sector. And all over the world, that tendency was crushed after the 1930s. And it was crushed in Latin America. My thought is, it was crushed everywhere in Europe by the rise of fascism and Soviet communism and the Cold War. So there was a radical retreat by professors who were very interested in the social implications, the political nature of law and internal critique. That disappeared. It was wiped out in Europe by
it became dangerous because of both the Second World War and the Cold War.
Yeah, exactly. So now that situation was tragic for European legal thought. One of the things that we were able to do as people became curious about her in the globalization process is, astonishingly enough, I could go to France and say, I'm here as a representative of René Demogue, a French social jurist with an extremely developed internal critique of legal reasoning and a highly socially progressively oriented understanding of contract doctrine. And they would say, Demogue is famous for it's a tiny detail of the doctrine of mistake in contract law. Otherwise, no one has ever heard of him, literally. So I could then be the person saying, you have in France a very interesting critical tradition. And I could do the same thing in Germany. I could say, heck is like Demogue. You have to study this. You people, how can you be that way? Now, then it turned out that Demogue was well known in Latin America. How did I discover this? You told me. You said to me in some lunch, you probably don't even remember, there are all these French people, and then you named as the people who were these people who actually had been totally misappropriated, but centrally. So there was lots of reading as they were neutralized, and the critical, and especially the internal critical dimension of their work was just eliminated. So they could still be cited.
Duncan, they were people as different as Louis Josserand, Julien Boncas, René Demogue. They were put on the same plane as the brothers Massot, as rather abstract doctrinal influences without the political maps that gave form to their understanding of the civil law. So there's an erasure, a disappearance of politicity in the readings of doctrinal authors from Europe that are read massively as creators of legal science, and in which there are no political projects or political differences. So there's a flattening of the map, despite the fact that when you simply get close to their books on arguments, of course, political direction and drive seem absolutely important to understand what is it that they are doing.
So, exactly. And the same thing is true in France, except the difference in France and Germany is that there is a self-conscious strand of establishment conservative people like the ones you are referring, who are aware of those people, so far from being assimilated as architects of contemporary legal science, they're radically marginalized. So even Génie, who is one of the most important figures in critical thought in law ever. When I arrive in France, they say, oh, Génie, he had some good criticisms of l'exégèse, but he had no proposals. He had nothing to say. So he was a good person because he threw some rocks. And we all know now that classical exegetical doctrinal understandings are completely wrong. Everything must be interpreted, among other things, in a more teleological way. Génie helped lead us in that direction. But the idea that Génie was an outrageous rebel, or Josserand even more so. So yes, these people are there in Latin America. They're there in Europe. They're not there in Europe. They're more, this strand is more present according to your account, which sounds right to me. So here's an anecdote. A very brilliant Los Andes graduate student, at the early stage of her studies in Cambridge, came into my office saying, and I said, what are you mad at? I'm only interested in movements. So I wanted to know what she was mad at as the basis of some dialectic or agonistic relationship to milieu. And she said, my professors were just complete legal formalists. They were completely and totally insensitive to any dimension of the social at all. So I said, this is just hard for me to imagine. So I asked her to bring me the Torts textbook, which the library, Roscoe Pound created a library so good that you could find this like that. So she brought the Torts textbook that had been in her class. And she said, here, and I said, well, let's look what they have to say. Who is their citing? Let's just turn the page. And there was Josserand on every other page. Josserand, experienced by her as part of the ultra-formalist dimension of her legal education, was cited to Josserand, who was a radical destroyer of the bases of the doctrinal system, a true reformer, and an anti-formalist, as well as as a political progressive as well. He turned to the right, as many of those people did. He eventually turned to the right. But in the beginning, the legal positions of the labor movement were all based on his thinking about the labor contract and worker injuries. So, but now I want to ask you a counter question.
Of course.
So that's a little picture of globalization. Remember, the third element was the organizational skills of David Kennedy, where he was entrenched at Harvard through our warfare as a movement to acquire an institutional base. So we didn't control Harvard, we controlled a piece of the action. So we were entitled by our political activism, which was very rebellious. Eventually they gave us a piece. They crushed our growth as a movement, and in exchange, they let us have some use of the Harvard brand. And David was a brilliant user of the Harvard brand, and he was able, in that way, to enormously increase the audience for critical legal studies, which he never called that in any way. Completely, it was new approaches to international law, third world approaches to international law, international global law and policy were his slogans, but within that, an enormous amount of critical legal studies was put forward. But the other thing was that in Europe, we could play against the people who wanted to block us the very card of Josserand de mort. And we did, making us of interest to people because Europe had no legal appropriation of the critical works of doctrine or of philosophy. We were also into Foucault and Marx and Althusser and Kierkegaard and Nietzsche. We were also into all of those radical left positions, including Derrida was an important influence. So we were doing in law with the strictly European philosophical thing, and we ignored American philosophy. So we never read an American, the only American philosophy was of interest was John Dewey. Since John Dewey, there was not a single American philosopher who we thought was even worth thinking about for 2 seconds. But we were now a primitive context, an impoverished hermeneutic context for the reception of the famous dead Europeans. So we each had our little library, maybe, and it changed all the time. So one year it was Habermas and everybody was reading Habermas. The next year, so then there's some disastrous, people going the wrong road with the wrong theorist. But basically, it's an impoverished context of reception. So we are just inventing our own version of European critical philosophy to apply to law. And that allowed us to go to Europe and say, you European lawyers are ignorant of your own philosophical and sociological traditions. You don't know anything about them. You're stupid. You think Derrida is dumb. You think Hegel was somehow refuted by who knows. You learned in class that all forms of idealist philosophy are trash. You learned that Marxism is simply irrelevant because it believed in the declining rate of profit and the impoverishment of the proletariat. You had all these nonsense ideas, so you just paid attention only to your hermetically sealed interpretive social structures, which have turned you into primitives. So we were able, once again, to have the experience of a battle. So now, Diego, I want you to tell me, what is your relationship? Both, you are an organizer. What have you organized and what are you organizing? What are you up to? So I just given you a biography, a sociologically embedded biography of a project. You're old enough, like me, so reminisce, what were you up to? What happened to you?
I think, Duncan, would you like me to speak as a young student or as a professor nowadays?
I want you to speak as a late middle-aged man, professor.
Okay.
Not
okay.
as a student. By the way, though I think you're going to tell me that the incredible significance of the constitutional moment, of the occupation of the constitutional court by the guerrillas, of your role as an organizer, as a student, those things can be part of your narrative, but I want the narrative told from now, in which the point is not what happened then, but what grew out of it.
Right. Right now, I think that the last article that I wrote and I haven't published, it's an expose. It's actually 2 articles in which I rescue from obscurity the work of Giuseppe Chiovenda, the main Italian procedural law doctrinalist, who translated into Italian and then the rest of the Romance languages, both towards Portugal and towards Spain, the high legal science that Germans had created for procedural law in the 19th century. Among them, Binchard and Bach and von Bülow. And what I'm trying is, when I'm trying to unearth this dogmatic and doctrinal science of process, as they call it, I want to bring into attention of my readers the insufficiency of that doctrinal analysis in terms of contemporary process and legal needs of the population. So what I'm trying to do, Duncan, is to deconstruct the so-called science of process, la ciencia del proceso, or procedural law, and trying to show the insufficient nature of doctrinal analysis vis-a-vis the actual sociology of conflict that is nowhere to be seen in the classical expositions of the field. And in that way also to manifest an discomfort with abstract analysis of procedural institutions that have no clue about the social structural determinants of conflicts in Colombia, that have no clue about the distributional aspects of both conflict and process within the population. And what I'm saying is that actually that type of study, which is both a critical sociology of conflicts in Colombia, it's a much better introduction to procedural law and to a theory of conflict that the now still reigning doctrine of process that has been leading the way for more than 100 years. So as you can see, I'm still trying to deconstruct very entrenched portions of doctrine that, in my opinion, hinder both knowledge and opportunities of action in people that work in both judicial modes of transforming conflicts and outside those judicial modes. And though that critique of doctrine can be humble in some ways, it's a major statement against the dominant doctrinal discourse that you still have, say, within a field of procedural law. And that relates to my critical experience, because as opposed to what happened in Latin America with Marxism in the 60s and the hippie understanding of the law, most people in the 60s that actually had contact with both Marxism and existentialism moved away from the law, rejected the law as a way of social action, and transfer much of the energy of those movements into unmediated political action. So either they renounced the law or simply caved in to traditional doctrinal analysis. So there was no middle way in which, say, critical discourses or non-doctrinal discourses could have a saying and a participation in the parliament of legal analysis. And that made legal analysis in Latin America so uniform and boring, because again, either these Marxists completely renounced the law or simply later were read as merely doctrinalist. They were reproducing the high products of European legal thinking.
So let me ask you.
Sure.
I get that. That's really interesting, and that fits my intuition of your project. And this is not a but, it's an and. So in this story, let me put it this way. What is the role of, let's say, Dworkin and the modes of transnational legal thought, which understand themselves as having an intrinsically normative understanding of what normative, seriously normative understanding of legality, a normative base for legality, which has a kind of serious universal ethical claim through, say, the idea of rights, from beyond law, but also totally animating law in every way, so that legal interpretation can be understood as a form of political action within the world of rights, democracy, etc. How does that connect to your, what sounds like a characteristic of you and all of us, anti-formalist internal critique of a mainstream piece of doctrine? So is it that once you've opened up and revealed both the internal gaps and conflicts and inconsistencies and maladaptation to the social moment, then you arrive with Dworkin as this, what's the inspiration for doctrinal reconstruction given the external as well as the internal critique of maladaptation of the doctrine to social conditions?
Right. I think that in this project, I'm far away from a Dworkinian type of reconstruction. Giuseppe Chiovenda and the Germans ended up with a reconstruction of a theory of action. And in the European procedural tradition, that thing was reconfigured as el derecho a la tutela jurídica efectiva. So there was already a transformation, let's call it a Dworkinian ethical transformation from the theory of the action towards a moral constitutional reconstruction of it, as el derecho de tutela jurídica and other forms of Dworkinian understanding of the citizen's right to sue and protect her rights before the judiciary. I'm past that point because one thing that I found in empirical research is that our obsession with the judicial resolution of conflicts is not borne out by the evidence, that such right to judicial action and response and warranty is not the main, by far, is not the main way in which people are actually managing their conflicts, and that doctrinal creation helps us misunderstand and misfocus the very important role that social structures have in the mediation of both disputes and conflicts in the region. So I'm a bit disparaging, I'm sort of moving away. I don't need that normative anchor for the argument that I'm making, because it seems to me that at this point, or at least the sort of descriptive analysis that I'm presenting, those doctrines and even recent constitutional reconfigurations of the same right are not really as potent in social reality as we thought they were. So I'm not very much into, again, the sort of normative project of the new constitution, but rather revealing the very intense maneuvering of conflicts and disputes that gets before anybody goes to court. In the last survey that we had here in Colombia, as I told you, less than 10% of all conflicts, I'm talking about serious conflicts, end up in the jurisdiction. And the 90% of those that end up in the state are actually mere news of criminal offenses that do not get managed in any significant way by the states. So with that picture in mind, the very doctrinal stuff and figures that we've been preoccupied by are not really that important to understand the field and the dimensions of conflict. So part of this attack on the science of process also involves a de-scaling of the importance of those central conflicts, including the start of constitutional analysis, which was el derecho a la tutela judicial efectiva. So actually, I'm sort of moving away from it, trying to offer a more a broader picture of conflict management in a country where lawyers seem to be intensely obsessed both with the judiciary, both because of ideological socialization first, and then probably because of material interests, because there's little money that lawyers get out of the social realm, and the whole focus on the formal judiciary seems to be connected also to professional interests and privileges.
So, by the way, exactly the same thing could be said of the United States. So this is one of those odd situations where instead of emphasizing that we're comrades from the antipodes, from the North Pole and the South Pole, how everything is so different, how could you possibly understand? You sound like an American critique of the American obsession, especially with constitutional law, but then we can see it all over the world. So I listened the other day to a program in which a European and American were rejoicing an incredibly important event to them is that the Constitutional Court, I can't remember in what country, has decided to treat climate change as justiciable under international law. To which, whoa, I'm just thinking, well, this is so sad. So it is so obvious that whatever climate change is about, it's burning up California. And moreover, whatever fascism in the United States is about, there, it's possible the courts will play a very significant role. But it's so unlike the hoped for role for the reconstruction of all society. Their role will be to actually declare, say, that Trump lost and order that Biden be admitted to the White House. And the question then will be, what will the army do? So now we're in the Latin American situation completely. What will the armed bands do? So the role of the judiciary will be either heroic or cowardly and craven, but it will not be developing the inner logic of the Constitution to reform society on every level. There's just a giant difference in those two ideas, and somehow one has transmuted into the other in many, many places of the world, and then they crash over and over again. They crash in Egypt or Turkey, they crash in Pakistan, they crash in Israel. Maybe you'd say it crashed in Colombia, maybe not. Then what about Ecuador? What about Bolivia? What are we to expect? I think we have to begin. I would say that I'm with you completely. The study of the structures doesn't require a powerful overarching normative understanding that would translate down into what judges should do in lawsuits tomorrow. It's much more relevant to the ethical construction of political action, which of course is in the context of legality. So it's what is justifiable ethically as action, given the way law functions and doesn't function, rather than searching for the true normativity, the immanence of law, hooked to some transcendence. No, I completely agree with you. Our agendas are weirdly similar. And by the way, you do realize what's happened, which is you've used up all the time for discussion.
I know. So I think I have just a question for you to close and then open up quickly for questions. Just give me a brief answer, Duncan. What do you expect of critical practitioners? What is the role of critical practitioners? It seems to me there are two adjectives and there's some tension between them. I think that lawyers, we should be somehow both critical and at the same time constructive. There's a tension between those two adjectives, but you yourself use the idea of being a constructive lawyer. How do you envision that double program of being both critical and constructive in the law?
So unlike most people involved in critical legal studies, my answer to that is completely disenchanted in this sense. I am completely in favor of activist lawyers. I've supported them all my life, and I've done activist lawyering, which I understand as done in bad faith, in the highest sense. In other words, I don't believe the rhetoric that we activists, including me, use to justify our proposals. So I was the author of a local referendum, try to get the law passed by a popular vote on tenants' rights. And so I wrote the brief in the court defending the constitutionality of it. And I would say I didn't believe a word of the argument beyond I was proud of it as legal technicality, but just as legal technicality. And I'm totally in favor of critical lawyers also using all the critical techniques. They're useful in litigation. The internal critique of this proceduralist is going to be useful but it can also be used by conservatives. So on the one hand, I totally am in favor of critical lawyers using every tool and appealing to the whole normative order constructively in the battle, in the ideological combat that they choose to engage in, but I don't understand it as intrinsically morally compelling, and I don't object to double consciousness, to an alienated relationship to something other than the craft.
Okay.
Very
thank
cynical.
you, Duncan. No, I think we have very many things to keep talking about. I would like for Jose Hernan and Javier Santander, if they help us with some questions before we finish. So please, Jose, can you help us with the questions from the audience?
And the questioner should identify himself or herself in some intelligible way, please.
Sure.
Hola, ¿cómo están? Aquí estamos con Javier Santander. Lo primero es, vamos a cambiar el canal de interpretación para que Duncan pueda escuchar las preguntas en inglés. Entonces,
so you Duncan, can move to the English channel for you to hear the questions. Jose will speak in Spanish, and there will be a translation. There will be a translation for you. Adelante, Jose.
Update, listo. Entonces, Duncan, ¿puedes confirmar si escuchas a Patricia?
Yes, I am.
Excelente.
And I've muted the original audio.
Entonces, vamos a leer una pregunta, Javier, una pregunta yo. Comienzo con... Bueno, una pregunta de Juan Zapata, es para Duncan. La reducción de formación en ciencia política al interior de los programas de derecho ha generado abogados menos hábiles para comprender la realidad y capaces de generar movimientos transformadores. Y continuamos con la pregunta para Diego.
Vale, la siguiente pregunta es para Diego, de Carolina Duque. ¿Cuál es su opinión sobre la posibilidad de considerar el nuevo pluralismo jurídico como una opinión crítica para evidenciar características y conflictos sociales que no son vinculadas, interpretadas en la ley o se regulan de manera selectiva conforme a intereses.
Okay, Duncan, you go ahead.
I think Diego needs to help me a little with that.
Sure. The student asked you if
Louder.
lawyers now,
Oh, wait. Okay, yeah, go ahead.
lawyers do not get much political science training.
No, you have to talk louder.
Okay.
I can't.
You just shut down the channels and talk and listen to me.
Great. Excellent. Go.
Yeah. Here we are. Nowadays, lawyers do not get much training in political science.
Right.
There's
That I
this
got.
huge division between political science and the law. Doesn't that reduce the capability of those lawyers to act in a political fashion, to move politically, to transform, and to be behind transformative projects?
So shall I answer that one before the
He
second
wants
one?
you to comment on the distance.
Yeah. Oh, I get it. I get it, Diego.
On the distance between okay, go ahead.
I get it. So that idea that lawyers should have some political science in their training is a progressive idea beginning, I think, in France in actually the late 19th century at Sciences Po and equivalent French law faculties trying to open up the discourse. My impression is that in the United States, undergraduates who eventually go to law school, sometimes they have basic education in things like political science, and sometimes they don't. My impression is that the capacity of lawyers to engage in politics, political lawyering, activist lawyering, organizing, those things I do not believe are much dependent on the form of education, except that the presentation of law as a thing, either in the progressive moderate mode of my childhood or today in the more formalist ways, that is the obstacle. It's not the other things you know, because no matter what your outside education is or what other courses you're taking, if you drink the Kool-Aid, you die. Drinking the Kool-Aid means if you accept the potion from the cult of law, it's the death of the brain, and you won't be able to think politically unless you have a way of thinking yourself out. And thinking yourself out requires critical legal studies, specific training devoted to dissolving the fetish, to decapitating and burying that fetish, putting a stake through the chest of the vampire, which is the belief in law as an all-powerful thing conveyed patriarchally by the magisterial teacher and his allies.
Thank you.
Do you agree?
Yeah, I do. I think that the question has a misunderstanding of our conversation, which is to understand politics and the politicization of law as part of the formal discipline of science, of political science, having to do anything with legal studies. And as I want to remind my Latin American audience, very many of the diplomas that we got in the region are as doctors of law and political science. Mm-hmm. So we are part, I mean, at least our academic law received this French influence. The law schools moved towards being legal schools and political science schools, but in that relationship, nothing new came out of it. Not a more politicized analysis of the law came out of it. And it was simply a name that actually, Duncan, this is really interesting, got filled in by the very positivist German doctrine of the state. So our political science was premised on Jelinek's, Kelsen, Stahl's, and the rest of the German guys that were creating a very apolitical theory of the state, which was instrumental for legal positivism and formalism. And that's the type of that was the type of stuff that we read, much more even than French institutionalism, which was somehow a lukewarm form of politicity, of politics. And that was our claim to being both doctors in the law and in political science, a sort of German backtracking of the theory of the state retooled for the juridical state.
And the other question.
Sure. Let's go with another question for Duncan.
There
Muchachos.
was another question already.
Yeah. It was a question about whether pluralism, legal pluralism, was part of a critical movement in Latin America. And I would say that both at the global stage and in Latin America, the pluralist argument ranks very high within critical and movements. We want to see things from other points of view, from other centers of both political and social power. I've seen that type of movement both in the conferences that I've attended in the global north, in the sites of production of CLS, and also I've seen their extensions in Latin America. However, in Latin America, there seems to be a more normative element to it. While in the sites of production, pluralism is a way of deconstructing the intervention of the state in race, ethnicity, especially in those two things. In Latin America, we have to make the critique, but then very quickly turn to the state to try to stabilize some at least minimal gainings for indigenous people, for Afro-Colombianos, for Afro-Peruanos, for Afro-Bolivianos. So this anxious clinging to the rhetoric of the law seems to be very urgent, and we haven't had time to assess or to reevaluate the costs of the rhetoric of the law, which are, however, intensely apparent now in several of those struggles that say indigenous peoples are enmeshed in several places in Latin America. So it seems to me that in Latin America, as I've told you, the reception of CLS is very much paradoxically intertwined with a Durkheimian aspiration. And that sounds weird from the type of analysis that you see in the United States, but here is still functional to advance especially the collective rights of indigenous communities in Bolivia, Ecuador, Peru, or Colombia. And that also helps us understand the misunderstanding, the mistranslation, and the local uses of CLS in a different context in which, again, there seems to be a space for both constitutional activation and the constitutional defense of rights of pluralist expressions of power and belief. Let's go for another question, please.
But Diego, this has to be the last question.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's really a pity, but then time ran very quickly. So let's take two other questions.
Old people like me, we are in our anecdotage and we can't stop. but we enjoy it. Now, let's have one more question.
Sure, sure. Javier y José.
Ok. Entonces, Duncan está escuchando a Patricia.
Are you in the English channel now,
Yes,
Duncan?
I am.
Good. Good.
Listo.
Good.
Entonces, bueno, le enviamos una pregunta en inglés a Patricia por WhatsApp. ¿Es posible que ella la lea? Sí, te estoy escuchando, Patricia. Listo. Que ya estamos pendientes. Es la pregunta
How interesting.
de César Ramírez para las dos.
An interrogation, an interrogatorio.
Es la primera. What should left critical?
So, I would say that the law and political economy as a new formation of left progressive law students and lawyers in the United States comes into existence at a moment when the kinds of critiques that were leveled against critical legal studies by critical race theory, for example, and by many feminist legal scholars are not that relevant, because in the law and political economy formation, it reflects an enormous modification of the composition and shifts in power within the left academy. So in this new formation, women are a very large representation, and all the varieties of people of color, which is African Americans are not the greatest representative group of the people of color who are active in law and political economy. It's many, many different groups. And in the United States, the existence of every variety of persons of color because of the prevalence of new immigrations, mixed marriages, and so forth, mean that law and political economy, if anything, needs, I would say, to avoid the total marginalization of people who speak in a conventional white male voice. By conventional, I mean not particularly interesting, just that's where they're coming from. So the identity picture is no longer that law and political economy it's not a white formation threatened by its own internal racist or sexist divisions or intentions. So I think the main danger is for it to locate the way its own internal sociology creates its own blind spots, which have been a gigantic problem for the left in the United States ever since, let's say, the Obama's presidency. It's an interesting question. So I would say that without going into the question of the validity or invalidity of particular critiques, which would be a whole other subject, one which I've spent many hours discussing with many people in all the different tendencies, because I was a hopeless mediator, a boat tossed on the ocean waves of discord within critical legal studies at that moment. I don't think that experience is directly relevant because of the shift of power in law and political economy. That's it.
I would say, Duncan, that we are trying we're
Diego,
trying to learn how
why
to do.
can't I hear
Sure.
you?
Probably you
I
have
see.
to turn off the channels.
Off. Okay, good.
Now, can you hear me?
Yes. What did you say? It's such a delicate topic.
I
I'm
was
very
saying
curious of what tactful intervention you chose to be the last one here.
No, I think that we're still trying to learn and to stabilize what are critical interventions in this milieu. The state, and COVID-19 has been a good example of it, has a stark understanding of the distributional analysis that the law has, but this is a sober and very tactical acknowledgement that they do in moments of atonement, when there's despair and manifestations on the street. At that point, it becomes a moot point of political analysis that the law is political, that has different consequences for different people according to social structure, and that acceptance is motivated by atonement in face of popular expression. However, these moments are rather marginal in legal consciousness. I think that the idea of the abstract man and the liberal fantasy that the law is simply the same for everybody continues to have a firm grasp of the understanding of the law for most lawyers and professors, that they take their legitimacy from that fantasy and are not willing to see the distributional impacts that the law has on different people. And with that premise, I think that we are still trying to reconstruct years of backlog that we have in both descriptive and normative critical analysis. The type of work that you've done in the United States, both in critique and reconstruction of doctrine and dogmatics, has been important, but cannot simply be translated as the canon for our own materials.
No, not at all.
And also the descriptive elements of it cannot be simply translated. They are a source of inspiration, but at the same time, there are both local realities that have not been fully either described by a critical sociology or a critical anthropology or a critical psychology, and then the engagements, the normative engagements with our own bramble bush of the law are tactically and scientifically different. So there's a large proximity in the goals of the interventions, but I think that we still in Latin America have to both stabilize and give a stronger foothold for those critical practices, which are still more important here than probably than in the United States, because of the huge inegalitarian structures of our countries. I mean, Colombia, Bolivia, Peru, Ecuador, just to mention the north of South America, are hugely, intensely unequal countries, and the law does not take a clear note of these because of the probably the hegemony of liberal legal thinking. And I think that we're go ahead.
Let me just make a reaction to the way you've put it, which is, I'm sure everything you've said is right. But I actually appreciated that the questioner made a specific reference to the American progressive movement, Law and Political Economy, which is a movement of young law professors, not many lawyers, though some activist lawyer practitioners, and law students and professors. So there are many, that is, there are dozens and dozens of professors and hundreds of law students out of the 30,000 law students in the United States. There are 100,000 law students. Out of the 100,000 law students, some hundreds are now mobilized in this way inside the legal academy. They experience the legal academy as not as formalist, but as dominated by a right-wing legal ideology, namely law and economics, along with a hopelessly moderate liberal, left liberal protesters against racism who have never supported any action because they're basically moderate progressive neoliberals. So progressive neoliberalism and law and economics are and a kind of constitutionalism, which is meliorist and marginal, are the dominant formations against which they're rebelling against an undefined, more radical idea for which critical legal studies is an important inspiration understood as totally prehistoric. So in prehistory, there was critical legal studies, which we must study in order to be able to fight better in the present. Now, in that, the story, a crucial aspect of critical legal studies is indeed that it was divided, and eventually one of the things contributed to its death, along with repression, was the conflicts between many of the leading white men and the more radical tendencies among African American and radical feminists, law professors. We're talking about law professors. Now, my own experience of a little experience in the Latin American context is that, and now those tendencies are in some sense already very powerful and dominant, as well as left implicit versions of critical legal studies in this movement. So, however, it is just as true, although the movement has assimilated an enormous amount of critical race theory, an enormous amount of feminism, different types, and a lot of critical legal studies, a lot of post-Marxist thought, they are a tiny minority in the academy. So the question for them is, what strategy can you pursue in the academy? Some of them will become ministers in the Biden government. Five. They'll become undersecretaries of something, and that's good. That's excellent. But there, when we get to the question of the academy, racist and sexist and also instinctively anti-white working class hostility to the modes and cultures of the American white working class are a basically unwritten background condition of existence in academia. So they aren't prominent issues. And within the progressive movement, the thought is they've been assimilated and incorporated. And the minute you get outside of academia, the situation is no different from what you are describing. So the question of how left intellectuals in the academy should relate to Black radical movements or feminist movements that have no connection to academia of any kind is completely unresolved.
Yeah, I think that those questions and the answer that you just gave simply are too far from what I'm seeing at the law school. I simply see a doctrinal analysis that passes as legal science. However, it has renounced any scientific aspirations to it because it is a repetition of well-known principles and maxims, and ends up simply, again, being a question of repeating the right summa or the right treatise. At the same time, that science has become the sign of a very technical socialization of bourgeois identity that connects to the idea of being a lawyer. and there's very little both race critical discourse or feminist critical discourse in academia. That's part of the luxury of elite law schools, while at the same time, you said that there were 100,000 law students in the United States?
Yes, that's pretty surprising.
Well,
but Diego, let me say,
Colombia has, but let me say this, Colombia has 1/6 of the US population, and right now we have what, 130,000 law students.
So two things in response to what you said before. You are completely right, and I certainly I was giving the wrong impression. We don't have the doctrinalist core that you have. It exists in the lowest prestige law schools. It's at the outer margin of legal education, where it is both depoliticized and non-scientific. So the depoliticized and non-scientific mode of instruction is there, but it's a distinguishing characteristic of the non-elite. And it's also class-based. The lower your social class, the more likely you are to go to a law school where that exists. And within the profession of legal academia, it's associated with non-prestige for the professor. Whereas in the rest of the system, everyone understands that it is post-political and post-doctrinal. So this is a radically different situation. It's not the chrysalis or the golden bowl has been shattered, and people live happily among the shards and disintegrated pieces of glass, and they're happy. So when you teach, you understand that everything you say has probably in the background political, social, economic, and probably in the background rejection of pure formalist doctrinal ideas, but they also are in the presence of law and economics, politically committed progressive constitutionalism, which is passionately Dworkinian, and also residual critical legal studies, depending on where you are. You could have 3 professors who are saying this is nonsense. So it's a post-political, post-scientific, and it's very, very odd in that way, but it's definitely been through the internal moment for which critical legal studies takes responsibility. So most professors who are old people understand the turning moment that produced this situation of love in the ruins. Think of it as love in the ruins was the critical legal studies rebellion combined with critical race theory and feminist legal theory. We blew it up in the 80s, but we didn't destroy it, and it's completely stable. It got rid of us as power, and it's completely capable of going on forever while denying that it's formalist and denying that it's apolitical.
Well, I'll have to tell you that the golden bow is here well and alive and has not been shattered. Yeah. And that creates an important difference in what I feel are the challenges that we're feeling at the law school. So Duncan, time has run really fast. It's really, really, really bad that we have to finish now. But
now or ever.
But we do. So I want to thank you. It's a pleasure to see you. I cherish this conversation and the many that we've had throughout the years, and now especially in presence of an audience that will appreciate getting to know you and to see you and putting a face to ideas that they've read in beautifully written, passionately argued papers that you have. I think that the literature that you've produced is exciting, stimulating, and I want to pay homage to that political and literary passion that you put on the things that you write. So I think that you are one of the best doctrinalists, a very sharp critical mind, but also an incredibly serious. I want to share with the audience this conversation that we've had for these 90 minutes. We've had 3 or 4 preparatory meetings before, and I want to stress simply the passion and the seriousness with which you take the political and the academic projects that you engage in, and that's always been extremely motivating for me. And I've learned those things probably as much as I've learned stuff from your papers. So I want to thank you for the both passion that you bring into legal analysis, the commitment that you bring into legal analysis, but also the unpretentiousness and the connection with the audiences, and the need to understand what it is that they need to understand, and probably we professors won't do that magic for them, but we do put points that might be helpful for an audience that it is searching for their own answers.
Diego, I'm so happy with that description. It's wonderful. It warms my heart. And you know already from the way this is unfolded what I think of you, and that I have many, many of exactly the same reactions back. I think we share an ethos, and it's all very well. We should praise ourselves forever in exactly this mode while we continue the conversation. I'm really honored to have been invited. Maybe someone will send me the questions that we didn't answer because we didn't leave any time to answer them, which would be great. So to the audience willing to sign in here by Facebook or YouTube, thank you for coming and listening. I'm deeply grateful that there exists this audience, which is growing, I think, for thinking along these lines. In a very dark time for me as an American, thinking about the political situation, which is also very hopeful as well as despairing, it's great to know that you are around. And I'm hoping to be in contact in the future.
Absolutely, Duncan. Thank you. One final thing, Jose Hernan, do you want to show the opening page of the web page?
Oh yeah, I'd like to see it too.
Absolutely. So, so it's a little thing. We want to try to create a community in the web page, and the community talks about lawyers that are constructive. I'm using that word, and we want to do stuff from the ground up. Listen to the initiatives that very many lawyers and students of law have around both Colombia and the Latin American region, and start working in networking. And the webpage will offer one platform for this networking, for getting to know very interesting progressive projects that are being now advanced in places and locales that we don't know of, the sort of isolated practitioners of critical analysis that exist on the field. And we want to start taking an account of those efforts and trying to network those efforts, Duncan. So I think that there's a huge network of people doing critical work in Latin America. There are more isolated or solo practitioners of that mode, and we want to offer support and a place to meet each other outside the elite law schools or the elite networks. And it seems to me just right that the network can give us tools for that, and that's one of the things we want to connect the people who want to strive for a constructive type of lawyering in the region, both at the Los Libertadores Law School, at the Universidad de los Andes, at the Universidad San Marcos, at the UNAM, at the Universidad Católica in Peru, both private and public universities, and try to assemble a place for these types of critical projects. We'll be talking more about the webpage. Please do check it out, see what it's already there. But the more important part will be in the so-called Formación de Comunidad. You can see that pestaña there, and Información de Comunidad. We want to start networking, getting to know you, getting to know the initiatives that very many law students have in their own universities, trying to get beyond and away from the most doctrinal, rigid type of understanding of the law and legal teaching, and we want to support that. And I'm sure that Duncan will be an animator of this community from time to time. I'm sure of it, and very many other people who surely will want to talk about the critical practice of the law and the critical understanding of the law.
Well, Diego, it's beautiful.
Thank you.
Really
Thank you.
beautiful. Such a
So, go ahead, please. Go ahead.
It's a great idea. I also love the graphic. I mean, the graphic is terrific and it's very provocative. In American terms, it would be provocative, and I'm sure it's provocative. It's terrific. And I love the project. It just sounds great. I mean, what more can I say? It sounds like the kind of, I would love to be involved with it. I'd love to keep you in contact, keep me in contact with it. And this is a beautiful ending for our conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you, Duncan, for being here. Mil gracias a toda la audiencia. Let me switch to Spanish to say goodbye. Mil gracias a toda la audiencia que estuvieron acá. Gracias por aceptar la invitación. Péguenle una miradita a la página web y vamos a tener unos canales de comunicación muy robustos y muy claros para que hagamos esa formación de comunidad, para que nos conozcamos como gente que está interesada en el derecho de una forma crítica, como abogados que pretenden ser socialmente útiles, constructivos, críticos, en una época en que creo que se necesita. Entonces, Duncan, thank you very much. Gracias a todos. Un abrazo muy especial. Por favor, conserven la salud, la sanidad en estas épocas, la serenidad en esta época tan difícil. En Colombia estamos viviendo unos días difíciles con unos desafíos políticos y sociales también de la mayor importancia, con interpretaciones políticas polarizadas, cruzadas, que tendremos que resolver como sociedad y país en los próximos días y meses. Y bueno, mil gracias a todos. Duncan, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Patricia Aljure, for the translation that you've helped us with. Y thank you very much, Javier Santander y José Hernán Aristizábal, for all the hard work and patience that you've put into this project. So thank you very much, everybody, and see you next time.
Goodbye.
Gracias, Duncan.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Thank you. Muchas gracias, Patricia. Todo creo que salió muy bien. Mil gracias. Bueno, José, cuénteme cómo nos fue.
Bien, Diego, un segundo terminamos ya la transmisión. Estamos en
Muy bien.
esas.
Tranquilo.